I'd like to start off the first Sunday of the new year with a really big thought. One of the central claims of the Christian faith is that Jesus of Nazareth was both fully man and fully God. And while for faithful Orthodox believers like yourselves, that doesn't sound that hard to wrestle with. I know it sounds difficult to wrap your mind all the way around it, but you're like, yeah, that makes sense. We know that to be true. That really is a very big idea. In fact, for Muslims and Jews looking across the aisle at Christians, that is the difficulty, the struggle in coming to believe in the Christian faith. It is that a man can possibly also be God just seems utterly impossible. And more than that, more than just the Islamic and the Jewish perspective on it, there is a concerted and ongoing effort to make the claim that the New Testament authors and the first Christians didn't really believe that. But later on, centuries down the line, uninspired Christians who never actually heard Jesus teach, they invented the belief that Jesus was fully God and also fully man. And so that's an ongoing effort to try to convince us that that's the way that belief came into the world. But the Christians in the first wave of our faith, the Christians in those early days did believe that Jesus was God. And I want to point that out this morning in a way that hopefully can emphasize they didn't believe it because it was convenient for them. They believed it because they were compelled to believe it because it is the truth. That's why those early Christians believed that, because it was in no way convenient for them to believe it. It did not fit nicely into their lives and into the way they wanted to do religion. It was not up to them to just decide to believe that Jesus was God. They believed it in spite of the fact that it was a very difficult pill for them to swallow. And it was such a difficult pill for them to swallow because so many of those first wave saints were Jewish. And they had a very high view of some of the spiritual things that God had taught them about for centuries. And that high view of those things had to change if they believed the truth that Jesus was God. So, for instance, the way they thought about angels. The Jews thought of angels as being extremely high and exalted spiritual beings. And so to believe that Jesus was God would mean that there is now a man who ranks higher in the spiritual realm than the angels. And that's a difficult pill for them to swallow. They believed that men like Moses and Joshua and the high priests who served in the temple, those were men who were truly great spiritual warriors. And yet to believe that Jesus was God is to believe that now there is a man who outranks those great men in the grand scheme of God's universe and his world. And even their views on the prophets had to change. Now, the prophets probably don't sound to us quite like they did to the first century Jewish readers of the Bible and the first century Christians. Because we think of prophets, and some of us have a tendency to think of prophets almost like fortune tellers, right? If you need to know where that lost herd of donkeys is that got out a few days ago out of the pen, you go and you ask Samuel and he'll tell you where to find the donkeys, right? And that story is from the Bible, so you know that did happen. But that's not nearly the extent of the prophet's role in God's relationship with his people. See, the Jews of the first century who had become Christians, they knew the prophets as a whole category of true spiritual greats. They were the men who stood up and spoke the truth when people hated them for standing up and speaking the truth. And they were the heroes of history, the righteous voices who spoke a truth that the society around them didn't catch on to until a generation or two or three later on. Right? It's the same way that we think of in this country the great figures of the civil rights movement. That they spoke truth that didn't catch on until after they were gone. That they weren't there to see it catch on among the generation, among society. That's the way that these prophets were thought of. The true greats, the visionaries who saw what was supposed to be among the people of God and spoke the truth about it and were hated for it until they were later respected And after their deaths, they were elevated in their esteem among the people. See, when they thought of prophets, they thought of men like Isaiah, a man whose way of communicating God's will was to write. Isaiah was a tremendous writer, and his writings were full of elegant sermons and poems that are still revered, number one, for their theological depth, and number two, for their beauty. Isaiah's way of communicating God's will was to write. When they thought of prophets, they thought of men like Daniel, whose way of communicating God's will was to receive and to interpret visions that would frighten kings and vagabonds. These great and terrible visions that God gave him. They thought of men like Ezekiel, whose way of communicating God's will was to build sandcastle cities out in the street where people could see him, and then destroy the sandcastle as an illustration of God coming to destroy the city of Jerusalem. They thought of men like Nathan, men who had the gall to stand up to a king and point a finger at him and say, "You are the man who has sinned in this situation." They thought of men like Jeremiah, whose way of communicating God's will included beautiful poems and sermons, and whose way of communicating God's will once had him go and buy a brand new pair of underwear, bury them in the soil near a riverbank until they were rotted and gross, and then dig them up and show the people to say, "This is how rotten you are." That's true. It's Jeremiah 13. Go look it up. That's in the Bible. And they thought of men like John the Baptist, whose way of communicating God's will included immersing people in water to show that they had buried their old sinful habits and were rising to a new way of life. All of those prophets got God's messages across, and the Jews of the first century, who became the Christians of the first century, they saw those men. They saw all those many, many weird and wonderful ways of communicating God's will, and they knew those men who communicated for him were great men, great spiritual warriors who were to be highly revered. They even decorated the tombs of those men centuries after they had passed away. And yet, our brothers and sisters who came from that background into the first wave of this same faith that we share, they had compelling reasons to believe that Jesus spoke an even greater message than any of those men, and than all of them put together. They had compelling reasons to believe that Jesus was himself greater than all of those many prophets and leaders from their history. Because Jesus, whom we will honor in just a minute in our eating and drinking the communion, is the exact same in person and power as God himself. Jesus is not just one among many prophets. Jesus is the prophet who is not only the spokesman for God, but he is the God who speaks. So that he not only speaks with the same message and words as God, but he speaks with the very voice of God. And they had compelling reasons against the tide of persecution and against all the natural inclinations that have been ingrained in them over the centuries and over their lifetimes. They had compelling reasons to believe that he is God in the flesh, the exact picture of what God's glory is like. And so now we come to the first Sunday of a new year, like we come to every Sunday, to appreciate and honor Jesus in the elements that we are going to eat and drink in just a moment. But I hope today we come and appreciate that through the filter of the greatness of seeing that this is a man who was God, a man who is God, even today, that we honor in doing this, so that we honor him as the greatest of men and as the humblest of all gods. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he, Jesus, upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Let's honor him as we eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Savior who was sacrificed for us.